It's a great pleasure to welcome participants in this latest installment in a series which began as a commemorative effort marking the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Irish School of Ecumenics. But it's become, I think, a phenomenon in its own right and has developed a community of interest around the speakers and the engagement, which has been orchestrated so ably by Jane over these number of months. Our topic this evening is a particularly important and timely one. I suppose reflecting on the development of peace studies as a perspective on issues of such great concern on the island and globally. Those who are contributing are better qualified than I to chart I suppose, the displacement of a perspective of war studies with peace studies, and that rather hopeful development, which the foundation of the School of Ecumenics was in some sense representative of, continues and never, sadly, in some respects, lacks material on which to engage. And as we mark the 25th anniversary of a particular stage of peace building and peacemaking on this island, it's important to celebrate that contribution of the discipline of peace studies, its multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity as practiced in ISE, and to hear the expert perspectives of those who've kindly agreed to participate this afternoon. So I'm very happy to hand over to Gillian to steer us onward for this afternoon's event.
Great. Well, thank you, Dermot, and thank you, Jane, as well, for all the work that you put into these webinars. Yes, it is a fitting time to be thinking about peace studies as an academic discipline committed to the understanding of the causes of conflict and the conditions of peace and the intersections of academic study with civic engagement. It's been an integral part of the history of the Irish School of Ecumenics for almost all of its 50 years, with the emergence of the certificate and then later degrees in peace studies, coming through the interconnections with ecumenism and interreligious and interfaith dialogue, but then developing from those healthy, wonderful connections into the multidisciplinary world of peace studies that has emerged over the years in our space. And I just wanted to remember today, actually, it's a year since Bill McSweeney died. And Bill, of course, was so fundamental to the establishment of what we know today as our peace studies program in our school, that it seems fitting that we're doing this just after the anniversary of his death. He's much missed. But peace studies has, of course, many manifestations around Ireland and beyond, but actually it's not as, in terms of the European scene, it's maybe not as widespread as it is in Ireland. We've seen lots of interesting peace studies developments in different parts of the island, and there are some of them represented here this evening. And of course, this is only some of the representation of the wonderful, vibrant academic community of peace studies scholars that we now have in our space. So I'm going to introduce, very briefly, I'm going to introduce each of the speakers just before they talk. They've all been given 5 minutes to speak to the first round of questions, and then we'll go for a second round of questions, and then the usual format of these webinars will have the time for questions from everyone in the room, which, as Jen explained, should come in on the chat, really, but we'd really love to hear your questions. We're going to keep the introductions really brief. Each of the people in this space have amazing biographies, but we don't have enough time for that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say just 1 or 2 sentences about each person, and Jen is going to put their link to their website in the chat, so you can follow up, and you'd also then, if you want to contact them afterwards, you'd have their details. So We begin our first round of questions, which is on the challenges and opportunities facing peace studies on the island of Ireland. And I'm going to ask Walt Kilroy to speak first. Walt is Associate Director of the Institute for International Conflict Resolution and Reconstruction at Dublin City University, and he's an academic expert on themes such as disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, and the protection of civilians in conflict zones. So Walt, over to you for the 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and everybody. It's lovely to see you all, and I really look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say. Do please just butt in or mute me when I get to the 5 minutes. I've started my timer, but we'll see how we go. Without doing a very elaborate introduction as to why this is important, because we've already heard that, let me try and launch straight into the challenges and opportunities. And this is really just to kick off a discussion, because I know we've got a lot of people online with a lot of experience. So I suppose one of the first challenges is something which is also an opportunity, and that is social media, which has changed the way we interact and the way, not just what we talk about, but how we talk about things. But we can also list that as an opportunity. If I knew anything about it, I would say something about AI. I don't know enough about it, other than to say it's big, it's going to affect everything. I've no idea how. I don't think anybody knows how. Certainly I don't. But I think really the underlying concern here is about a sense that it's easier to express anger, and it's easier to express intolerance, and it's easier to other people in those particular ways of communicating. And we've seen people fomenting this in the south of Ireland, certainly in relation to refugees and asylum seekers in the last 2 months, which has been very disturbing. But we've also seen like the pushback in the US in relation to rights in relation to abortion and the trans community, and indeed the wider LGBT plus community. And this is something that concerns everybody, because if there's less space for one group, it's not a zero-sum game. If there's less space for one group, there's actually less space for everybody. I suppose the other obvious one is the Ukraine war, which, although it's in another part of our own continent, it does show us that interstate violence, sadly, hasn't gone out of fashion. It's not a thing of the past. And also, it makes us question the thing that we've often promoted in peace studies or tried to have taken more seriously, which is the effort to de-escalate and the effort to reduce the threat that we present to other people. The usual security dilemma that, like, the stronger we feel, the more threatened another side feels. Well, just trying to be non-threatening, it's not an automatic guarantee that that's going to make another leader respond in the way that we expect. Some leaders will ultimately see things as a zero-sum game. Some leaders will still see things as that they need to dominate and be supreme in order to avoid being dominated. I mean, the example from 20 years ago, you know, the US and its allies invaded Iraq, even though it actually wasn't threatened at all by Iraq any longer. So sadly, it means that we can't just say that it's a guarantee that if we try to be less threatening, it will de-escalate. It's not a guarantee. And then obviously this raises questions for neutrality. Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, and I can understand their position. And that leaves fewer countries as neutrals within the European Union, which we do have a response to. How are we doing for time? 1 minute and 1 second left. Okay, a couple of opportunities. Social media and AI. There are mixed blessings, to put it mildly. I would like to think that the opportunities are as big as the challenges, that the anniversary of the Belfast Agreement or Good Friday Agreement. It's an opportunity to reflect, not just on what happened, but how it happened, and the work that remains to be done. Without wanting to sound too theoretical, I would see that the growth of complexity theory and systems thinking, which is now beginning to be more widely recognized, they'll help us to understand peace in a more holistic way, and I'll talk about that later if people want. And then the last thing is in terms of dealing with the challenge of neutrality, rather than becoming paranoid and seeing everything as a threat to neutrality and becoming very purist about it and looking for moral purity, I think it behoves us, with my own timer, it behoves us to be much clearer about our own definition of neutrality, not necessarily a purist one, but a definition which leads us to understand the possibilities and the opportunities that neutrality can provide to try and bring about a better world.
Brilliant. Thank you, Walt, and beautiful in the timing as well. Well done. And yes, raising, even in just 5 minutes, managing to raise really important questions about different forms of violence that still we are very aware of, and some of the ways in which that might be approached, which we'll hear more about. Okay, so the next person to speak will be Maura Braniff, and Maura is in Ulster University, and she has spent time as director of INCOR in Ulster, and her work is around issues of peace and justice and truth recovery. You can read more about Maura's work if you follow the link in the chat. Maura, over to you for your 5 minutes on challenges and opportunities for peace studies.
Thank you very much, Gillian. I will not be as diligent as Walt was with his time, because that's beyond my capacity. So it's wonderful to be here today, and I feel it's a very special occasion to be here with all of you. And I think I'm going to pose more questions, and I want to hear a little bit more about what our participants today, why they're here, and what they think the peace studies should be as well on this island as we move through the next, our next generation. I suppose whenever I was invited to this event, I was particularly excited. It felt very innovative. It felt very new, but it also felt, why have we not done this before? So why are we not talking about what is peace studies on this island? Because on this island, we have came through INCOR, where I'm situated in Ulster University. We were founded by one of our inaugural peace scholars in 1993, at the height of what it meant to build peace in Northern Ireland. We're celebrating the anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, as Walt has referred to, but peace building and conflict resolution and bringing people together started much earlier than that. In Northern Ireland, we were very lucky to establish INCOR in 1993 to work collectively, to think, theorize, and to assess the process of building peace. My concern, and I have a couple of challenges, is that maybe peace studies as a curriculum has moved into the postgraduate element. It's moved into a very inaccessible form of curriculum, because if you don't have an undergraduate degree or you don't have experience, so you maybe can come in as a practitioner. My concern is that peace studies as a discipline remains out of reach whenever we know on this island that we need to be continually building peace. And that's, I suppose, one of our core aims within INCOR, is to really establish that peace studies is for everybody and for everyone. And my question to everyone in the room today is do you feel that the curriculum and that peace studies matters and is agile, adept, and responsive to you, and also accessible to you? I don't believe that academia alone can teach peace studies or can educate or train or inform peace studies, and I think there's a there's a lot of work to do to continue to advance the conversations, and not just the conversations, but actually to build a process around broadening who contributes and how they contribute to peace studies. So that leads me into my second point, which is around practice. We have a well on this island. We have 1,000 wells of people who know how to build relationships and people who know how to connect, how to engage with difference. And I'm not convinced that peace studies as a curriculum or as a discipline has fully theorized or co-designed or collectively worked through how we can learn from each other. We should have done this, but I'm concerned that we haven't. And the reason why I'm concerned, and it is a concern, is that generationally we start to move through generations, and we have lots of young people coming into peace studies that want to learn and want to build on their grandparents' experience or their great-grandparents' experience, and we don't have the theories sufficiently developed on this island. My third point, Gillian, tell me if I'm running out of time, but my third
30 seconds. My
third point, and this is one I really want to make, is that what we do at home on this island is different to what we do abroad. And I'd like to have a bit of a conversation about abroad, Ireland, and this island. We focus a lot on the rights-based kind of approach to development, peace building and aid. But at home, it's a very different discussion. It's about security. It's a very different discussion at home. And I think on this island, we can maybe reflect on what we do rather than teach other people what they should be doing always. So that's my opening.
No, that's fantastic, Maura, and really, really challenging and profound for us all in many ways. And you're asking questions to everyone in the room, which is great. So any participant on the call who wants to respond to Maura's question, why are you here today? Why are you participating? Do you find peace studies to be accessible? I saw there was one comment already that agreed with you, basically, that it's not. So if anyone wants to get into that discussion, please feel free to start putting things in the chat, because those are really important questions that Maura has put up to us as a collectivity in this call. So thank you. Next, I'm going to turn to my colleague David Mitchell, who's part of our School of Religion, Theology and Peace Studies, but he's based up in Belfast in our Conflict Resolution and Reconciliation programme. And David is an expert on the politics of peace processes, with particular interest in Northern Ireland, and has done lots of work with Jin on comparative work around peace processes, Northern Ireland and Korea. So David, over to you for your thoughts on the challenges and opportunities for peace studies.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and thanks, Jin, for the invite. I mean, this is quite a unique event, and it's quite rare that we ever think about what we do. We're usually talking about other things, but we don't really talk about what we actually do in our roles. So this was quite interesting thinking through this. I haven't taught peace studies anywhere except Ireland, so I don't know what's distinct really about it, but I can maybe guess and say a few things about that. Just to explain where I am in Belfast, this course is a one-year Master's in Conflict Resolution and Reconciliation. And we're here, we don't just happen to be in Belfast. The course was created here by the ISE in order to be an input into the peace process here, to equip peace builders, and to speak into the context. So we're here in our location for a purpose, although most of our students are international now. They're not local, and they're people who want to come and learn from the Irish experience. So we're doing that kind of balance between Ireland and between other cases, between theory and practice and experience and so on, and trying to keep all those things together. For this first bit, I just have three challenges. And the first one is very similar to what Moira was talking about accessibility.
you know, we know only the elite of the elite do a master's degree, you know, globally. And so many of our courses are master's degrees. You need time, you need money, you need entrance requirements. And we know that academia in general is skewed towards people from more privileged backgrounds. I think we're also somewhat preaching to the converted a lot of the time. We're teaching to pro-peace oriented people already. Having said that, we do get a lot of students who are from conflict zones, and we get a lot of students from the United States, which, although not a traditional conflict zone, has huge levels of violence and division. So I wouldn't overstate how skewed the demographic is, but there's definitely accessibility issues. And I do sit down on a September and look at our small group and sometimes wonder, you know, why do I not have 200 people looking back at me doing this subject? Partly because I just love it. It's so interesting. And, you know, it's obviously crucial to the survival of humanity. So where are all these people? We don't get the big numbers like you do in the traditional disciplines. And I wonder why that is. And is it about perception, marketing? I don't know. The second challenge is a kind of double one. It's keeping up with the discipline and keeping up with what's going on in the world. The discipline is expanding all the time. Some people will know Ramsbotham, Woodhouse and Miles' famous textbook, Contemporary Conflict Resolution. I heard them speaking in Belfast a few months ago, and they were talking about the process of updating it, which they do every so often, and they always go into the process thinking it'll be easy, and then they discover that there's all this new material that they have to incorporate, and their book just gets bigger and bigger every time. So for us, sort of mere mortal lecturers, it's also very difficult to keep pace with all this. And to keep pace with what's going on in the world and the remarkable contexts and disparate contexts that our students come from, it is tricky to, you know, I always think it's hard to grasp more than one or two cases in any detail. You know, some people manage to have this encyclopedic knowledge of many different contexts, but I struggle, and I'm always paranoid about saying anything about somewhere that I don't really understand. So dealing with that, bringing the Irish experience to all these very different experiences is tricky. And then the third challenge, I think for our course, which is a one-year course in Belfast, trying to draw on the Northern Irish context, the challenge, I think, is sort of avoiding becoming stale or formulaic. You know, we know that we're all part of the peace industry, and that industry metaphor suggests, you know, we are kind of doing similar things. We're producing similar products. I say the same things a lot to different groups. We bring in people to the classroom who say the same things. And I wonder, you know, 25 years after the agreement, you know, where are we now? We're not really in an implementation period. We're somewhere else. People are talking about different types of future. We've got surprising problems, Brexit, and then all these new problems that spread out like sort of tributaries. It's disorienting. You know, am I going to just run this course like this for years and years, and we just do this thing? How do we respond to the context? How do we find new ways of opening up the subject? So avoiding formulaicness is my third challenge. So avoiding formulaicness, keeping up with the discipline and what's going on in the world, and then the accessibility of the subject. So I'll come back to some of more positive things then later.
Yeah. Thanks very much, David. Perfect timing as well, which is great. And yeah, so echoing some of those questions about accessibility, and I see some people are picking that up in the chat and providing some thoughts on where peace studies needs to be beginning rather than maybe at, as you said, the elite level and so on. So sparking some interesting developments in our chat as well. The next speaker, Heidi Riley. Heidi's working as a research fellow in the School of Politics and International Relations in UCD. And she's an expert in the area of gender and armed conflict, and is currently leading a research project called Talk for Peace on transformative mediation. So Heidi, it's great to have you here. And again, more details about Heidi in her link in the chat, but over to you for your thoughts on all of these many challenges that are coming out of the woodwork tonight.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you for all of the other insights so far. I've kind of rethought maybe some of the things that I might originally have wanted to say, given what has already been discussed. But I might just start with mentioning that I'm a former student of International Peace Studies course, and that, in fact, that's what originally brought me to Dublin for 2 years, and I've never left. I had a wonderful time on the course, and then went on to do a PhD, which I would never have done had I not been a part of the course. But I just wanted to pick up on kind of my memories of the course in a way to consider the current challenges. What I remember was particularly important about my time in ISE was the number of international students that were there. And I think that's so important in terms of lesson learning, sharing of ideas, and vibrant discussion on different contexts, different conflict contexts. But I think one of the challenges now that we have is we're in a situation where there is a housing crisis. There is, huge problems in terms of the cost of living crisis. So the ability to be able to attract these wonderful international students is now becoming more problematic. And I don't know how that's affected ISE, but just from general discussions, I suppose, I think that's really problematic. And from that perspective as well, I might just pick up on Mara's point about the kind of having to have an undergrad before you can go and do a master's. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many people working in practice on this island who have an absolute wealth of knowledge. Some of them might not have an undergrad, but they don't necessarily have access to be able to do a master's. I have to say, I'm not currently teaching, but I was previously teaching in UCD at undergrad level in peace and conflict course, and at third year undergrad level, and the interest in peace studies was huge at that level. So I would have maybe 90 students, and there was some of them would go on and carry on and do a master's in that area. So I think it's unfortunate that actually the focus on peace studies is as if it's something that has to be only focused at the kind of a very higher theoretical level when it's such a practical course, or a practical discipline, shall we say. And I suppose that just maybe leads me into one of the opportunities that I might mention on the island of Ireland is because there is such a wealth of practitioners and such a wealth of networks of practitioners. And in a sense, it's a small community to a sense. A lot of people, know each other, that actually teaching peace studies can be more connected to practice. And I think that is an opportunity which is exploited to some extent, but possibly could be exploited more. So, for example, the development of more internships, or practitioner guest speakers, for example. I always found that to be really important in teaching, is to bring in practice guest speakers. Because a lot of people that go to study peace studies don't necessarily want to go and do a PhD and end up in academia. A lot of them actually want to end up in practice. So having that voice between practice and academia, I think, is really important. So that's one of the opportunities, and I'm just looking at my timer there, 50 seconds. So I might just say one of the other challenges, I think actually there's a bunch of challenges that I haven't gone over, but one of the challenges, I suppose, is, in picking up on Walt's point about the kind of the Ukraine situation, for example, there seems to be a much greater focus on militarism, and even Ireland's neutrality has been questioned, I suppose, of this current situation. So in terms of funding for research, I think there's a concern that actually there's a push towards some funding in the security studies area, in areas such as, countering violent extremism, much more kind of what we would see as hard security studies, and possibly a pushback in the area of peace studies. So I think this is one of the challenges that has to be navigated in the, in the current context. And I'm not going to carry on now because I've think I'm just on 5 minutes.
That's absolutely perfect, Heidi. Thank you. And yeah, so really important issues raised there, both about the connecting to those issues about pedagogy and access, but also to Walt's points about the political context in which we are teaching this subject. So very important as well. And I hope that'll spark some questions and discussion in the chat as well. So the final person on the first round is Gladys Scaniel, and Gladys was a colleague in the Conflict Resolution and Reconciliation Masters in Belfast, but currently she is now a professor at the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice in Queen's University Belfast. And Gladys's work covers many areas, but including religion and conflict, and dealing with the past in Northern Ireland. So she's a great peace studies person because she already negotiated with me for 5 minutes and 30 seconds. So as a negotiator, she does very well. So over to you, Gladys.
Well, my second part will be 4 minutes 30, hopefully, so I'm trying to be fair. But it's always when you go last, it's a bit difficult. Some of what I say will resonate with what has gone before. And I think it could be argued that our own peace has been the greatest opportunity for peace studies on the island of Ireland for the past 25 years. I mean, we're all familiar with and probably weary of that language of lessons from Northern Ireland, right? So I think that is an opportunity. As it's already been said, our peace studies programs on this island tend to attract a lot of international students. That was the case when I worked at ISE and also at Queen's University. A lot are from the United States, and they're very eager to learn these lessons. And one of the reasons they come to Belfast or to Northern Ireland is because of its status as a post-conflict society. So we're the living laboratory up here, if you want to put it in those terms. And a lot of the international students look at it like that. And when I worked at ISE, I usually started my first class by telling these international students that my goal was that they would go home realizing that our peace process had not been as successful as they'd been led to believe. And what I hope they learned was that, you know, to use Galtung's terms, there's a big difference between negative peace and positive peace, with Northern Ireland being much closer to that negative absence of violence rather than the positive shalom of human flourishing. So for me, that means it would be fair to say that in our rush to advertise our peace process success to the international audiences and to attract the international students who pay higher fees, right? Not to be too cynical about it, we've neglected promoting peace studies amongst people who live on our island. So I think this picks up some earlier points. So I think one of the main challenge to peace studies on the island is that a lot of people, I don't want to discount the practitioners whose hard work's already been mentioned, but a lot of people are actually uninterested or apathetic. Much of the population is about the study and achievement of positive peace. So when I worked in ISE, we had 1 at most 2 students from the island of Ireland each year on the Belfast course. The MA in Conflict Transformation and Social Justice at Queen's does recruit better among local students, but this is partly because we have a natural pathway for the Queen's undergraduates, you know, across our faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences to go on to the Masters. So there it is. At Queen's, I also do teach a 2nd-year undergraduate module on the sociology of conflict and peace processes. And in that, I cover Northern Ireland, Rwanda, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Zimbabwe. And interestingly, this year, nearly half the students are international or study abroad students on that module. And that's unusual in my school to have so many international. But to me, it underlines that point, that there seems to be this greater international than domestic appetite for understanding our own peace process. And that's assuming that the domestic students are those who are the most interested in peace on the island. And some of them do bring a really great knowledge base from their experiences. But even then, I'm often surprised by how many are unaware of, say, key figures or initiatives from our peace process history. Just to end with an anecdote, earlier this semester, in a lecture on dealing with the past, an international student in that undergrad class expressed her incredulity that Northern Ireland had no official monument to commemorate the Troubles, you know, akin to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. So I explained that there were literally hundreds of competing memorials throughout Northern Ireland. And then I described the efforts of the NGO Healing Through Remembering to promote an annual day of reflection on the 21st of June. And then I asked the local students if any of them had heard of this day. Not one of them had. So I don't think that's a reflection of my students' lack of interest. These are the ones who are actually in the undergraduate course, but rather, you know, the failure of the people in power at many social and political levels to prioritize and widely disseminate discussions and initiatives about what it would actually mean to achieve positive peace on the island. And this failure is well illustrated by our apparent inability or perhaps unwillingness to deal with the legacy of the past. So indeed, I think the biggest challenge to peace studies on our island is that we will come to be defined not by our so-called successful peace process, but by the missed opportunities for peace that are stemming from our failure to openly and adequately address the past. So.
Wonderful, Gladys, and you actually did it in less than 5 minutes. So you get your full 5 for the second round. But yeah, and thank you. That's very really important reflection there on the building on those discussions about who is studying peace studies, but bringing it to the local question of are we reaching a new generation of people in our own on the island who we would like to see engage with peace and dealing with the past. So it's been a really, I mean, I didn't know what would come out of this round, and it's been absolutely amazing. There's an amazing mixture of questions about the nature of the programs we offer, who they're reaching, who's not being reached, how we are teaching, how to make sure teaching doesn't become, as David said, formulaic, but then also questions about what we're teaching, what are the current issues around violence and peace that really need careful analysis and discussion, how we connect the work of the Academy to the work of civic engagement. All of these are really important, and we got some really nice comments already from people in the Zoom call asking questions about responding to the questions about who is doing peace studies and where is it being done and at what levels, and interesting points about second level, even primary level for education around peace, which really picks up on many of these points that people have been raising. And we maybe I'm sure some of you will want to pick those points up in your next 5 minutes, and we can come back to them at the end as well. And I see more comments coming in as well as we speak. So you've set out the challenges. What do you think might be the ways to overcome them, and what are the ways to maximize opportunities for a flourishing peace studies space on the island of Ireland? Walt, we come back to you for your second 5 minutes, please, starting from now.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for the really interesting comments. And I'll probably be under the 5 because I want to hear more. I know we have a lot of experience in the audience as well. I suppose what I'd see our main task as doing, apart from trying to provide analysis and tools for people, is that ultimately I'd see our task as trying to build capacity. To build capacity for peace. Now, I know some people get very triggered by this term capacity building because it always has the implication of, oh yes, well, we're the experts, we'll come in and we'll show you where you've been going wrong. Sometimes in a kind of a semi-colonial or absolutely colonial way. That's not the approach or the sense in which I mean it. And I pick up very much on Maura's point that there are extraordinary unrecognized capacities everywhere in the everyday negotiation and navigation of peace. So in a way, when I talk about building capacities, that also means recognizing the extraordinary capacities that are there and celebrating them. But I think that also means a very great connection and interconnection between, as Heidi and others were saying, between practice and research. I have to say I'm more or less agnostic about, this may sound very shocking, while I take education as an extremely important, almost sacred occupation. Not that the people doing it are holy, but I'm agnostic in terms of the usefulness of academia, I have to say. And I'm still kind of more my center of gravity is probably closer to practitioner than to academic. Maybe that's a heretical thing to say, and too bad if it is. But I certainly wouldn't see any kind of hierarchy where academic research is at the top and stuff filters down from there to people on the ground. If there is a hierarchy, I probably think it's the other way around. But ultimately, it means very careful listening and very careful engagement with the extraordinary things that are happening on the ground every single day. Just to pick up on one point in relation to accessibility, somebody was mentioning like not having the primary degree in order to do a master's. I'm not underestimating for a moment, I hope, the obstacles in relation to doing a master's, including, you know, financial, having the time and so forth. But most master's programs, I would hope, certainly the ones here in DCU, like having a primary degree is not a requirement. If you do have expertise or experience, life experience, that can be taken in lieu of a primary degree. So I'm not going to use my full 5 minutes because I want to hear more from other people, but ultimately I would see that as ways to deal with the challenges. Our job is to contribute to, not that we're in charge of or responsible for, is to contribute to capacity building the capacities of societies to manage the conflicts and tensions, which will always be there, in ways that don't involve resorting to violence. And I'm fully aware that that is the original definition of peace building, which I know peace building it's very unpopular to say anything positive about peace building. I really appreciate, I'm going out on a limb here. This is, this is non-orthodox. I know we're not allowed to say good things about peace building because it's always liberal peace building and top down and imposed. But the original definition talks about building, helping to build the capacities of societies to deal with their tensions. It doesn't say who should do it. It can be done from within. It doesn't say how it should be done. It doesn't have to be top down. So that's my little bit of non-orthodoxy for the day.
Thank you very much, Walt. We do love non-orthodoxy, and that's always good to hear. And yeah, importantly, those discussions about where peace building happens and models of peace building, and the importance of building capacity, which seems to be at the heart of much of what we're talking about this evening, and how that's done and where it's done. So thank you very much for setting that out for us. Maura, you want to come back in now?
Yeah, I will indeed. Thank you. And yeah, just as Walt was talking and as everyone else was talking, and the questions as well, I was reformulating my response to the opportunities. I suppose at Ulster, we've always kind of tried to mitigate against this idea that you have to have your undergraduate degree. So we do have a very sophisticated kind of program of widening access. So like, I'm literally, we have classes and peace studies from 14, 16-year-olds right through. And we work in partnership with a lot of organizations to be able to deliver those. I suppose I still feel that the practitioner-led program, which we categorize as APEL, where people can apply, we still receive very few applications. So it might be marketing, it might be me not advertising it enough, but we welcome the opportunity for people to accredit their experience. And honestly, it just makes for such a better classroom. It makes for such a vibrant learning experience for everyone, no matter where in the world they're coming from. I suppose my other opportunities that I want to say is that we're an island. We know climate, we know environment, we know youth, we know inclusion, we know new people moving to our island. We have a depth of experience in, as I've said, managing relationships, building relationships. All of this contributes, and I just like to see peace studies continuing to build upon what we are all in this room, virtual room, doing. And we can build on our past. It's been a difficult and contentious past, but we can build on that into our present generation and into our futures as well. I suppose my other point I'd like to make at this moment is, and it hasn't really came up yet, is I think we still have an opportunity to maybe decolonize our curriculum and our libraries. I feel that we still have significant legacies of colonialization on this island that both north and south that we need to maybe pay attention to, and there's an opportunity for us to do that. My other opportunity is that all of our policy deliverers, so everyone who's working in the public sector on this island, is coming into confrontation and interfacing with issues around social exclusion or conflict, or all of the issues that we're dealing with in our peace studies programs. But peace studies is not mainstreamed as a discipline or as a track through our public sector, and I think that's something we need to have a conversation around, because we know that that's what everyone actually who's working in the public sector, whether they're in criminal justice, housing, health, wherever they're placed on this island, they're dealing with peace building and good relations activity. And my final point, and I think I'm couching it as an opportunity, but I think it's also a problem, is that I don't think that I'm trying to figure out how to say this correctly. I don't know that we're doing enough around curriculum, around measuring, evaluation, and just knowing what it is that we do as practitioners. I feel that we still have an opportunity to learn from what works and what doesn't work, and we're not educating that as part of our peace studies curriculum. And I feel that's where, and as Walt has said and as others have said today, is we need to blend, we need to kind of build into the economics, the built environment, the engineers. We can't work together just by a social science lens, is all I'm saying. But also let's think about how we know what we do works. And it's okay if it doesn't work as well, because that's important too. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Maura, and I like that last comment about knowing that it's all right when things don't work, because we all experience that very often in our lives, so it's good to be reminded. But yeah, those are important points as well, and I'm glad, yeah, returning to the issue of widening participation and access and who should be included, but also the important point about decolonizing the curriculum, which is something we need to think more about as well. So thanks for bringing that one into the discussion. David, your response to the challenges.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm not sure I'm fixing my own challenges, but I'm rather sort of pointing out good things about teaching peace studies in Ireland and opportunities. But so I sort of have two main ones. One is about the discipline of peace studies, and then the other is about, you know, the Irish setting and its opportunities. So I mean, firstly, I think the main opportunity is simply the ability to impact people through teaching the subject. That's always going to be the potential, the possibility, the benefit. And we can indeed sort of equip people, hopefully, with some ideas that might help them solve conflict. I know some of my students are listening, and we had a sort of feedback session because we're coming towards the end of the year the other day. And one of the things they said, which I was pleased to hear, they said this was the first course they'd done where they'd actually been interested in the readings, which was a lovely thing to hear. Nothing to do with us. I'm not blowing our trumpet. It's simply because I just think the field is such an interesting and engaging one. Human conflict and human peacemaking are just really engaging topics. And I think peace studies also, it's not just about opening up an academic field for people. I do think it can be, you know, a transformative peace education experience in itself. I mean, I did a master's at Ulster, 20 years ago, and I think I had a transformative experience. you know, I think I went through a bit of the old conscientization of peace education, you know, where you become more aware of the social structures that you inhabit and become sort of equipped to change them and are less fatalistic about the world. So I do think that potential is always there, that idealistic sense of the transformative impact. And then secondly, in terms of the Irish context, I think there are numerous distinct and really good opportunities. You know, and again, we've already talked about this massive legacy of human experience in peace building that the peace process has produced, and that's there to be tapped into. And it is true that we don't often, I'm not doing it in a systematic way, or maybe we haven't worked out how to bank a lot of this kind of knowledge and wisdom, but it is there, right from the diplomats right down to community workers. I also think part of that is also there's a kind of there's a landscape or an ecosystem of discussion around peace that exists, particularly in Northern Ireland. And I'm just talking about all the many events, debates that still go on about politics and society here. So for instance, we've just had the Imagine Festival, which had so many interesting events. You know, you have the West Belfast Festival, Four Corners, loads of ad hoc academic and community events. I mean, they're happening all the time. I mean, we get used to them. They're sort of old hat, I can't go to them all. And yet it's actually a really fascinating thing and a great thing for students who come to sort of tap into this and see that I think the North is quite a self-aware, developed place. We like talking about, you know, politics and society in the future, even if, you know, we're disagreeing, and I think that's a great thing for students to sort of soak up. And then finally, the sort of paradoxical benefit of Northern Ireland is that it's the problems that we still have problems. The thing is in flux, the thing is contested, the thing is ongoing. It's not perfect, and I think that again, pedagogically, it makes it really interesting. Now, of course, we'd rather live in uninteresting times. We'd rather that the peace process was done and dusted and none of these things still occurred, but they do. You know, we've got ongoing problems of dealing with the past, ongoing problems around Brexit, and now we're talking about the future, whether it's reforming the institutions or United Ireland. And I think, you know, I was saying earlier about the danger of becoming formulaic, and that's true, but I've also found that it's almost impossible to become really formulaic, because every year there's new things to talk about, there's new things to see, there are new topics, and that just keeps things live. And certainly in my sort of discussions with people who come to Northern Ireland from different conflict zones, they often find the flaws, the unfinished parts, some of the most fascinating and valuable aspects of learning the lessons of Northern Ireland. So yeah, so those are the two benefits: the sort of the richness of peace studies itself, and then the richness of the Irish context in which to study it.
Thank you so much, David. And yeah, absolutely, it's so true. This idea of the wealth of knowledge and in the context, and how are we going to capture that and connect to people who have that wealth of knowledge as well, is really an important question. So thank you for raising those. Heidi, what are you thinking in terms of responses to your own challenges and other people's challenges?
Okay, so I'll just make a couple of maybe short points here. So just following on from David's excellent point around, you know, the continuation of problems, shall we say, you know, on the island of Ireland, and how actually that can be part of the learning process as well. And that's in a sense that kind of the rich context-specific knowledge that exists on this island is so important in terms of learning on the island, but also in terms of lesson learning outside of the island of Ireland, shall we say. And I might just pick up on the point about the decolonizing of libraries, of the literature. And I think that that's also a very important point, as I think David mentioned, the Ramsbottom book, you know, which is seen as the kind of, you know, the conflict resolution kind of handbook, shall we say. But actually, I think there's such a wealth of new research of, looking at conflict through completely different lenses. So, for example, from a gender perspective, looking at it through an intersectional lens, and shifting from, peace studies was very male dominated and still is, and then that needs to be kind of maybe addressed as well. And also the fact that conflict itself, interstate, intrastate conflict generally has changed over the last 30 years. So how is that reflected in our libraries and in the literature that we use? So I think it's important to be kind of checking what literature we're using and looking at new voices and things, for example, around everyday peace, intersectionality, as I mentioned. The other point I might mention is just coming back to the research side. So I think there is so many opportunities for new research on the island of Ireland, but often the challenge is funding for research as well. Now, for example, the North-South Research Programme is an opportunity for collaborative research. But these fundings are quite limited, and if we're going to be continuously creating new knowledge through which we can teach peace studies and through which we can create new ideas, then there has to be some funding for new research. I mean, certainly in terms of PhD funding, it's very limited and it's very difficult for individuals to carry out a PhD without funding. So I suppose that would be one of the challenges. And just one more point. I think what's very interesting is some I'm just saying there is new research that where the focus often is on the kind of the elite level, but looking at what's happening at the grassroots level, both on the island of Ireland and outside, is particularly important to examine. I think, bringing back to maybe Walt's point around kind of complex peace building, complex processes and adaptive peace building, and looking at how this kind of ecosystem works. I think that, there's new opportunities for research in that area that can maybe connect more to teaching. So sorry, that might be a bit of a ramble, but anyway.
Not at all, not a ramble. Very astute, and and thank you too for bringing in the research question as well. We've focused a lot maybe on teaching and connectivity across society to the wealth of knowledge in peace studies, but also how do we where do we research and how do we research, and is really important for our discipline as well. So I'm glad you brought that in as well, Heidi. And a final word to Gladys on dealing with challenges.
Okay, thanks very much. So earlier, the two challenges that I identified were the apathy of the population towards building positive peace and the collective failure to deal with the past. So some of what David said earlier about the vibrancy of the conversation in the North, I think that's true to some extent, and maybe seems to contradict my point about apathy, but I'm not really sure that it does, because as I think actually David said in his early remarks, it's kind of a preaching to the choir type situation. There's a vibrant elite conversation perhaps, but that I think there is still this wider apathy. And when I was preparing for this, I looked at the publicity for the event that noted that peace studies academics have, quote, an ethical responsibility towards research that helps bring about positive change, not only on this island, but around the world. So no pressure there. and given what I've said, I mean, does that imply that we failed in this, if our population on the island is a bit apathetic about positive change closest to home? Now, it's a question, and I think it would be kind of absurd to blame university peace studies departments for, such a wide-ranging failure. But at the same time, I think we can ask if we can do more in our research and teaching that could reach beyond the walls of the universities. So ISE certainly has a long history of effort in such endeavors. So even when I was working in my PhD at UCD back in the early 2000s, I interviewed some evangelicals who said in those interviews that participating in events related to ISEs Moving Beyond Sectarianism project had, helped change their perspectives and motivated them to become involved in peace building, and not liberal peace building, that bottom-up peace building that has been mentioned. And many of my colleagues at the George Mitchell Institute in Queens are involved in research with similar outreach aims with a range of groups. But bringing it back then to dealing with the past, and what I said of that remaining, in my view, perhaps the outstanding issue of our own peace process, I think we should be asking what we as peace studies academics can be doing to communicate the urgency of this more widely in the public sphere. And we should probably be framing dealing with the past as an ethical, moral imperative that's relevant not just to Northern Ireland, but the whole island. And I think that's something that gets forgotten sometimes when we talk about dealing with the past. And I try to do this in my own research. And the research I did with the Presbyterian Church that resulted in the book, Considering Grace, I would consider that an attempt, to make a contribution there. And as scholars, we know that the history of the Troubles, it's not unrelated, to an island-wide history of strife that literally spans hundreds of years, and there's colonialism involved as well as already, the decolonial aspects we've mentioned today. And we know that the legacy of events leading up to and including partition had negative consequences for people across the whole island. So is there anything in our peace studies departments that can contribute to sparking an island-wide moral imagination, if we want to call it that energizes our population to address the legacy of the past? And I think this should include addressing not just the Troubles in the North, but also things like the legacy of abuses in the Catholic Church, in the Republic particularly, which I think can and should be related to that legacy of colonialism and partition. These things didn't happen in a vacuum. So for me, addressing this complex legacy, it's a matter of justice for victims and the common good. And is this something we can be putting out there a bit more? So despite the current lack of evidence for our population's appetite for such a process, I live in hope anyway, as it were. I suppose I'd hope my remarks wouldn't be as insular as they've turned out to be, so focused on Ireland. But I just want to end by saying I also think that peace studies on the island needs to pay attention to issues that are energizing our students. So the young people in my classes, they're concerned about climate change, gender equality, global inequalities, terrorism, wars elsewhere, these things that have already been mentioned. And in some ways, I suppose what I've said today, it actually may be a critique of the focus of my own work, as well as the wider field of peace studies on the island. But I fear that we may be left behind as a peace studies scholarly community on the island if an insular focus on the travails of our own negative peace, prevent us from linking grand challenges like climate change to achieving positive peace locally and globally. And we know climate change is likely to contribute to an expansion in global inequalities, wars over natural resources, climate-induced migration to the global north. These things are coming, and we need to address our own past, but be mindful of a future that may bring even greater challenges and require a new moral imagination to change our ways. So I'll end with that.
Brilliant, Gladys, thank you. And it's great to open up the discussion at the end there about the wider global situation that we are doing our work in. Amazing round of thoughts and ideas. And the last part of the evening, we're open to questions and comments. I might begin by just looking back at something, a very specific question that was asked by Heather Godfrey. Heather wanted, but particularly to Maura, because she put the question in immediately after Maura's second intervention, but Heidi, you also mentioned this, and Gladys, the idea of decolonizing the curriculum. What do we mean when we're talking about that, and why is it so important for peace studies scholars?
Yeah, it's vitally important. And as someone who I spent my life studying in kind of related fields to peace studies. I normally went to the conflict side, I have to say, and it was only after kind of a little bit more emotional maturity I started to realize that I shouldn't be studying conflict, I should be studying peace, because that's what the place in which I need needs. So I think Heidi addressed this quite well already, and also Gladys. But in terms of the decolonization, our libraries are full of books written by Western, middle-aged white people, and typically men. That's not to say anything about men or middle-aged or white, but whenever that's all you're reading, you're missing some very important voices. And our libraries, and it tended to be, whenever I was studying, that I would go into class, collect my module handbook, and there wouldn't be another female. And it was, and even whenever I went into my master's, I was one female out of 15 students who were studying for their masters, and I was the only female in Belfast studying. So it's about decolonization, but it's also about diversity, and I think it's about representation, and and that's a process. That's not, it can't happen by magic. It can't happen by, oh, let's read this. We need to systematize it, and we need to say to every political science, peace studies, geography, all of the disciplines that speak into peace studies need to be cognizant that we have diversity, and we need to pay attention to inclusion. And that goes right to the very fabric of our reading lists, into everything that we do, always. So I'm welcome, and I'm open, and anyone can email me stuff and tell me what I should put on my reading list. I'm completely open to that. But yeah, I'm kind of, I feel that we're in Western Europe anyway, we're behind the curve in making sure that our disciplines are incredibly diverse and inclusive. We need to be better on that. I need to be better on that. So send me stuff. Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, there's an offer. Thank you very much. I think I see there's an interesting question that kind of touches on the multi or interdisciplinarity of peace studies we have. Smita Chakraborty has written to us. She says she's from India. She's interested in doing studies that combine peace and psychology. And I mean, we talk about peace studies being interdisciplinary, but I think we know ourselves in our outfit in Dublin that we're not, we're not equipped in a sense to talk to psychology, or we don't have psychologists. But I recognize, and I see it in students as well, a growing interest in neuroscience and how the sciences intersect with, and medical science and so on intersect with peace studies. So if anybody in the panel wants to speak to that, ways of combining peace and psychology, I see Heidi's waving at me. So Heidi, over to you.
Sorry, I hope it was all right to jump in like that. Just very quickly, I think this is really interesting, and I am absolutely no expert in psychology at all, but I've kind of been recently moving into kind of examining conflict-related trauma in peace building, and I think that's a really interesting. The little I kind of have been looking into it's a really, really interesting area. And as you mentioned, there's people like Mary Fitzduff, was it? That was, she does peace building and neuroscience, which is really, really interesting. I mean, I can't answer how you should kind of enter into doing a PhD in that way, but I think there is, in the literature, there is a greater shift in incorporating psychologies. As for example, the Journal of Peace Psychology. I don't know if you've seen that one at all, Smita, but have a look. And also kind of it's linked with, I think, Laura Taylor's work in UCD with the youth. but she's in psychology, but working on peace building in the youth, and somehow I'm not entirely sure what the program is focused on entirely, but it's a mix between focusing on psychology and peace building. So my point is that I think we have to peace building is interdisciplinary, and I think it's really exciting that we're now looking more towards the sciences as well to be to speak to it in a way. I'm not sure I can fully answer your questions, Smita, but certainly look at that journal, look at if you're interested in conflict-related trauma. And I think actually on the island of Ireland, there is also some excellent work on conflict-related trauma from a practice perspective as well. WAVE, for example, got some excellent reports in that area. So I hope that's a little bit helpful.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Gladys, you had your hand up, I think.
Yeah, just a quick answer to that question. As I said, sociologist, I speak with trepidation, right? But I am aware of one program at UMass Amherst that is the psychology of peace and violence. I believe it's taught at master's level. So they have an expertise there. And I think Linda Trop would be one of the leading scholars in this in terms of like the psychology of intergroup contact theory and that sort of thing. And she's at UMass Amherst. So, it's like the psychology, it's an area as a sociologist that I should probably be engaging more with. But as Heidi was saying, there are folks out there who are doing this type of work. Some of my colleagues in psychology in Queen's as well work with Laura Taylor at UCD. But yeah, just to give that the work at UMass Amherst a bit of a profile as well. And personally, I'm interested in learning more about that as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone in the room is following the chat, because there's lots of exciting things happening in the chat. And this is sort of discussion going on about everyday peace and examples of the kind of what was referred to earlier as the kind of well of experience and knowledge that exists on the island. And Geraldine Smith, our colleague, is providing some really lovely answers and examples of civil society work and everyday peace building that in the chat. And it's lovely. I see Julianne Funk here. Julianne, I know from a European research project, and she raised again the kind of issue of the way in which other contexts around Europe, there's also this kind of lacuna around younger people learning about conflict and peace building from the Balkans and so on, that again, speaking to the need for this accessible broadening of engagement with peace and conflict beyond the walls of the postgrad university. So really interesting stuff going on in the chat. I think it's maybe, given that we're ISE at 50, this question from John Bowl is interesting. Given that peacekeeping is a core Christian teaching, blessed are the peacemakers, are Christian denominations on Ireland involved in an encouraging of peace studies? Anybody on the panel want to speak to that one? Gladys, you might be the obvious person to answer this.
Oh, sure, I'll have a go. Well, again, I suppose the answer to this depends on where you look in the churches, right? So throughout the Troubles and even in the present, the post-violence period, there's been I suppose a small cohort of people who see as core to their vocation as a Christian this need to build peace on the island, because they read the gospel, they read the scripture, and they read what you're reading and they say, well, look where we live, this must be what we're supposed to do here. But that is a minority. Now I don't have numbers, I don't have quantitative data that tells how many Christians on the island think that way, but it is definitely a minority of those who prioritize peace building. The institutional churches themselves have had programs and initiatives over the years. You could list many of them. Some of those programs come through mechanisms like the Irish Council of Churches. Geraldine has mentioned a couple such things in the chat I've noticed popped up. Or that all the main denominations had programs post Good Friday Agreement to promote peace building. Church of Ireland had the Hard Gospel, Ed Hill Methodists had the Reconciliation Project, the Presbyterians had Gospel and Conflict. These were funded for a set period, usually externally, And when the time came for the denominations to decide, would we continue to fund peace? The decision was generally no. So that tells you, I think, something about the priority maybe placed on it at, a denominational level. At the same time, that probably sounds like a criticism of the denominations, because I suppose in a sense, maybe it is from my perspective, if I count myself amongst that minority of those who do see, think that if you're, a Christian on the side, and that should be part of your your lifestyle or your vocation, or whatever. So where does that leave us? There are still some things going on, like the Presbyterian Church supported the project I mentioned earlier that I was involved with in terms of considering graces, trying to make a contribution to dealing with the past. But at the same time, that project was funded primarily by the Irish government's Department of Foreign Affairs. So that the aspect of minorities doing work and having to go asking other people to pay for it, I think is an interesting dynamic. So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
That's a pretty comprehensive answer, Gladys. So unless anyone else wants to speak to it. David.
I would just say, the question was about encouraging peace studies. And I haven't come across churches encouraging people to sign up for masters in peace studies. Unless I've missed it, but that specific connection between churches and the sort of the academic discipline, I probably isn't really there, apart from say in ISE, for instance, which embodies that connection. But so everything Gladys says, absolutely. But in terms of the actual courses, I'm not really sure.
Well, I see there's a comment here from Drew Gibson saying, in addition to what Gladys said, and probably what you just underlining what you just said, David, to put it bluntly, most churches are more interested in things other than peace building, evangelism, church planting, and slowing the decay of membership. So thank you for that comment, Drew. There's a question further back up the chat about positive peace, which has been mentioned a few times this evening, and of course is a concept those of us working in peace studies are, it's kind of bread and butter type concept that we're so used to. But somebody, CT, has asked, how do you go about measuring positive peace? And I see Julan put in a little link that might help with the answer to that. But so thank you for that. But anybody want to come in on this idea of positive peace and how we can research and know it and cultivate it? Any panelist want to come in on that? Walt, we haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah, I was going to nominate Walt.
Very much. Give me the easy questions. Yeah, right. Gosh, positive peace. In a way, it underlies everything that we do, and some of the work is about making visible a lot of the agendas that we have and being explicit about things that we might think of as kind of values or aims or objectives that we just assume are there. But ultimately, I would say positive peace is about putting relationships at the center of what we do, the making of relationships of all kinds. And that means we have to include power and empowerment and lack of it in our analysis. It's such a huge, broad area that I wouldn't claim to have any magic way of summing it up. But if we don't have relationships, and if we don't have power, and if we don't have identity within our analysis, then I think we're missing something really fundamental.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Heidi, I think you were going to say something, were you?
I'll just say something very brief, but if it's the question that says how do we measure positive peace, I think the difficulty is this measuring, and often we're focused on indicators, specific kind of numerical indicators and things, and actually it really speaks to this to the idea of diversifying our literature, we also need to be diversifying the methods that we use in terms of understanding positive peace, I think. So understanding narratives of individuals as well as also part of, understanding positive peace. Looking at structural violence, for example, issues of poverty, issues of lack of access to resources, education, they can be maybe numerically measured to a certain extent, but what about the lived experiences of those individuals? And I think that that's also really important in diversifying how we look at peace studies and how we understand positive peace. So
yeah, absolutely. Gladys.
It is something quick. I suppose to add to that, some people may be aware of Ron Inglehart and Pippa Norris's work on measuring what they call existential security or insecurity. And their work is in the context of looking at secularization. And one of their findings is that the more existentially insecure a society is, the more religious it is, right? But putting that aside, the idea that the indicators that show more security, okay, so people have a standard of living that's decent, there's not huge levels of inequalities, either economic or between genders, all sorts of indicators like that, you could almost say their measurement of security is quite similar to positive peace in a way, lower levels of crime and violence, higher levels of equality, those sorts of things. To me, it's kind of like positive peace, maybe that might be helpful as well.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. And Maura.
Yeah, I suppose just on the back of Walt and Heidi and Gladys, I think one thing that we suffer from in the North is that we haven't had this impulse to refine our grammar or our vocabulary around peace, or we haven't changed our vocabulary around peace. And because we're kind of still haunted by the issues around paramilitarism, etc., segregation, peace walls, interfaces, and so forth, the ideas of positive peace 25 years after an agreement haven't really kind of become part of our vernacular. They're not part of our everyday. Our everyday is negative peace. And I think there's something maybe we should all, and I constantly think about it, is about how we get to a place where we're not just thinking about this dichotomy between positive and negative peace, but it's actually the process. It's the temporalities between moving through that process that is so difficult and is so demanding for everyone who's in this situation as well. So I think there's definitions, but there's also processes and experience, which kind of just is building on.
Absolutely. No, those are all really helpful comments. I think in the original question about measuring is yeah, as you say, there are ways and indicators and indices, and there's a thing called the Global Peace Index as well. The person who asked the question, CT, you might be interested in, but again, that's a kind of attempt to put numbers against factors and indicators, and then, but at the same time, peace is also, as Maura said and Walt said, it's process and it's relationship. So things that are not so readily measurable in facts and figures. So it's very interesting. We're running out of time now, I'm afraid, but I hope everyone is multitasking and watching the panel, but also reading the chat, and lots of interesting comments about the role of the churches in peace and peace studies and encouraging reflection and learning and reconciliation. Some contrasting comments there from different members of the room, and all really valuable. So thank you. This just to sum up, I may just read through the last couple of comments here from Colm and Maeve. In conversation with our grandson and son about holidays, the grandson said he'd like to go to Korea. I need to explore that, but I said, I know a man from Korea. Who could this be, Jim? So it's great that this has all of this discussion at primary school level has stimulated this. So I think that's a nice little anecdote and reflection on that these conversations about peace and reconciliation can only start early. They don't have to wait for third level discussions, but can begin in primary school as well. And that's lovely reflection to have that's been a running theme through this evening about access and levels of education and the wideness of knowledge on the island around peace, and how do we connect and how do we bring out all this knowledge, etc. So thank you for that. And Alex Chance, lovely that you're here as well. Alex is a PhD graduate and a Peace Studies graduate and a PhD graduate, and he talks about, yes, the importance of looking at that point that came up earlier about the difference that peace studies makes, not falling into only understanding things through the hard security lens, but looking at this idea of positive peace. So I think, Jin, you're probably going to tell me it's time to stop. Yes, absolutely. We still have nice comments coming in. Smita as well, who asked about psychology and peace. She's also offering some ideas about young people and peace building there. Thank you for that connection, Smita. And some nice thank yous as well. So brilliant. Well, I found it really exciting to be in this. I just want to thank the panel. I really feel that there's lots of things we've heard tonight and from both the panel and everyone's comments in the chat that really makes it feel exciting to be a peace studies person, to be honest, but also challenging. You know, how do we develop our discipline in ways that are engaging and accessible and inclusive and decolonized, and reach out to more and more people and enthuse people for the subject matter of peace studies at all levels of life. So amazing thanks then to I see them in this order on the screen: David Mitchell, Gladys Gagnon, Heidi Riley, Walt Kilroy, Maura Braniff, to Dermot McCarthy from the ISE Trust, and of course to the man from Korea who could work for the Korean Tourist Board as well, it seems, as well as the peace and reconciliation aspects of Korean society, Dongjin Kim. So thank you all very much. And there will be more of these webinars, but as of yet, the plans for the next one are not 100% made yet, but Jin has the list of everyone who joins in, and we'll be spreading the word about the next ISE at 50 webinar in due course. So thank you all very much and have a good evening.